History of the World by J. M. Roberts, Book 8, The Latest Age, Chapter 3, Crumbling Certainties, New Challenges to the Cold War World Order. Japan was, nevertheless, long favored by circumstance. The Vietnam War, like the Korean, was a help. So was the American enforcement of a bias towards investment rather than consumption during the occupation years. Yet human beings must act to take advantage of the favorable circumstances, and Japanese attitudes were crucial. Post war Japan could deploy intense pride and an unrivaled willingness for collective effort among its people. Both sprang from the deep cohesiveness and capacity for subordinating the individual to collective purposes, which had always marked Japanese society. Strangely, such attitudes seemed to survive the coming of democracy. It may be too early to judge how deeply democratic institutions are rooted in Japanese society. After 1951, there soon appeared something like a consensus for one party rule, though irritation with this quickly showed itself in the emergence of more extreme groupings, some anti liberal. Mounting uneasiness was shown too over what was happening to traditional values and institutions. The costs of economic growth loomed up now, not only in huge conurbations and pollution, but also in social problems that strained even Japanese custom. Great firms still operated with such on the basis of group loyalties, but rest by traditional attitudes and institutions. Nonetheless, at a different level, even the Japanese family seemed to be under strain. Economic progress also helped to change the context of foreign policy, which moved away in the 1960s from the simplicities of the preceding decade. Economic strength made the yen internationally important and drew the Japanese into Western monetary diplomacy. Prosperity involved it in many other parts of the world too. In the Pacific Basin, it was a major consumer of other countries' primary produce. In the Middle East, it became a larger buyer of oil. In Europe, Japan's investment was thought alarming by some, even though its aggregate share was not large, while imports of its manufactured goods threatened European producers. Even food supply raised international questions. In the 1960s, 90% of Japan's requirement for protein came from fishing, and this led to alarm that the Japanese might be overfishing important grounds. As these and other matters changed the atmosphere and content of foreign relations, so did the behavior of other powers, especially in the Pacific area. Japan increasingly assumed in the 1960s an economic predominance in relations to other Pacific countries, not unlike that of Germany towards Central and Eastern Europe before 1914. As it evolved into world's largest importer of raw materials, New Zealand and Australia found their economies increasingly and profitably tied into the Japanese market. Both of them supplied meat and Australia minerals, notably coal and iron ore. On the Asian mainland, the Russians and the South Koreans complained about the Japanese fishing. This added a new complication to an old story. Korea was also Japan's second biggest market. The United States was the biggest. And the Japanese started to invest there again after 1951. This revived a tradition of distrust. It was ominous to find that South Korean nationalism had so anti Japanese a tone that in 1959 the president of South Korea could urge his countrymen to unite as one man against not their northern neighbors but Japan. Within 20 years, too, Japanese car manufacturers were looking askance at the vigorous rival they had helped create. As in Taiwan, so in the South Korea, industrial growth had been built on technology diffused by Japan. Yet, although Japan's dependence on imported energy meant a nasty economic shock, when oil prices shot up in the 1970s, nothing seemed for a long time to affect Japan's economic progress. Exports to the United States in the 1971 were worth 6,000 million US dollars. By 1984, that total had grown tenfold. By the end of the 1980s, Japan was the world's second largest economic power in terms of GDP. As its industrialists turned to advanced information technology and biotechnology and talked of running down car manufacturing, there appeared no reason to think that it had lost its power of disciplined self adaptation. Greater strength had already meant greater responsibilities. The withdrawal of American direction was logically rounded off in 1972 when Okinawa, one of the first of its overseas possessions to be reacquired, was returned to Japan, a large American base there notwithstanding. There remained the question of the Kurils, still in Russian hands, and of Taiwan, in the possession of Chinese nationalists and claimed by the Chinese communists. But Japanese attitudes on all these matters remained, no doubt, prudently reserved. There was also the possibility that the question of Sakhalin might be reopened. All such issues began to look much more susceptible to revisions or at least reconsiderations in the wake of the great changes brought to the Asian scene by Chinese and Japanese revival. The Sino Soviet quarrel gave Japan more freedom for maneuver, both towards the United States, its erstwhile pattern, and towards China and Russia. That too close a tie with the Americans might bring embarrassment became clearer as the Vietnam War unrolled and political opposition to it grew in Japan. Its freedom was limited in the sense that all three of the other great powers of the area were, by 1970, equipped with nuclear weapons, and Japan, of all nations, had most reason to know their effect. But there was little doubt that Japan could produce them within a relatively brief time if it had to. Altogether, the Japanese stance had the potential to develop in various directions. In 1978, the Chinese vice president visited Tokyo. Indisputably, Japan was once more a world power. If the test of that status is the habitual exercise of decisive influence, whether economic, military, or political, outside a country's own geographical area, then by the 1980s, India was still not a world power. This is perhaps one of the surprises of the second half of the century. India moved into independence with many advantages enjoyed neither by other former European dependencies nor by Japan in the aftermath of defeat. It had taken over in 1947 an effective administration, well trained and dependable armed forces, a well educated elite, thriving universities, some 70 of them, had much international benevolence and goodwill to draw upon, a substantial infrastructure undamaged by the war, and soon the advantages of Cold War polarization to exploit. The country also had to face poverty, malnutrition, and major public health problems, but so did China. But by 1980, the contrast between them was very visible. The streets of Chinese cities were by 1970 filled by serviceably, though drably, dressed and well nourished people, while those of India still displayed horrifying examples of poverty and disease. This made it easy to be pessimistically selective in considering India's poor development performance. There were sectors where growth was substantial and impressive, but such achievements are overshadowed by the fact that economic growth was followed closely by that of population. Most Indians remained little better off than those who had welcomed independence in 1947. It can be argued that to have kept India together at all was a great achievement, given the country's separatist nature and potential divisions. Somehow, too, a democratic electoral order was maintained even if qualifications and peaceful changes of government occurred as a result of votes cast. Yet, even India's democratic record looked less encouraging after 1975, when the Prime Minister and Nehru's daughter, Mrs. Gandhi, proclaimed a state of emergency and imposition of presidential rule akin to that of viceroys in the old days. One of the two Indian Communist parties supported her. This was followed, it is true, by her loss of the elections in 1977 and her judicial exclusion briefly from office and parliament the following year, which could be thought a healthy symptom of Indian constitutionalism. But on the other side of the balance were the recurrent resorts to the use of presidential powers to suspend normal constitutional government in specific areas and a flow of reports of the brutality of police and security forces towards minorities. It was an ominous symptom of reaction to the dangers of division that in 1971 an orthodox and deeply conservative Hindu party made its appearance in the Indian politics as the first plausible threat to the hegemony of Congress and held office for 3 years. That hegemony persisted nonetheless. 40 years after independence, Congress was more visibly than ever not so much a political party in the European sense as an India wide coalition of interest groups, notables and controllers of patronage, and this gave it, even under the leadership of Nehru, for all his socialist aspirations and rhetoric, an intrinsically conservative character. It was never the function of Congress, once the British were removed, to bring about change, but rather to accommodate it. This was in a manner symbolized by the dynastic nature of Indian government. Nehru had been succeeded as Prime Minister by his daughter, Mrs. Gandhi, who had begun her divergence from his wishes by setting aside his request that no religious ceremony should accompany his funeral. And she was to be followed by her son, Rajiv Gandhi. When he was blown up by an assassin, he was not in office at the time. Congress leaders at once showed an almost automatic reflex in seeking to persuade his widow to take up the leadership of the party. In the 1980s, though there were signs that dynasticism might not prove viable much longer, Sikh particularism brought itself vividly to the world's notice in 1984 with the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi, once more Prime Minister, after the Indian army had carried out an attack on the foremost shrine of Sikh faith at Amritsar. In the next 7 years, more than 10,000 Sikh militants, innocent bystanders, and members of the security forces were to be killed. Fighting with Pakistan over Kashmir too broke out again in the later part of the decade. In 1990, it was officially admitted that 890 people had died that year in Hindu-Muslim riots, the worst since 1947. Once again, it was difficult not to return to banal reflection that the weight of the past was very heavy in India, that no dynamic force emerged to throw it off, and that modernity arrived slowly and patchially. As memories of pre-independence India faded, the reassertion of Indian tradition was always likely. Symbolically, when the moment for independence had come in 1947, it had been at midnight because the British had not consulted the astrologers to provide an auspicious day, and a moment between 2 days had therefore to be chosen for the birth of a new nation. It was an assertion of the power of Indian ways that were to lose little of their force in the next 40 years. Partition had then redefined the community to be governed in much more dominantly Hindu terms. By 1980, the last Indian civil service officer recruited under the British had already retired. India lives still with a conscious disparity between its engrafted Western political system and the traditional society on which that has been imposed. For all the great achievements of many of its leaders, devoted men and women, the entrenched past, with all that means in terms of privilege, injustice, and inequality and inequity, still stands in India's way. Perhaps those who believed in its future in 1947 simply failed to recognize how difficult and painful fundamental change must be. And it is not for those who have found it hard to accomplish, much less fundamental change in their own societies, to be supercilious about it. The world of Islam. India's neighbor, Pakistan, had turned more consciously to Islamic tradition and so soon found itself sharing in a movement of renewal which was visible across much of the Muslim world. Not for the first time, Western politicians had again to recall that Islam was strong in lands stretching from Morocco in the west to China in the east. Indonesia, the largest Southeast Asian country, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Bangladesh between them, contained nearly half the world's Muslims. Beyond those countries and the lands of the Arabic culture, both the Soviet Union and Nigeria, the most populous African country, also had large numbers of Muslim subjects. As long ago as 1906, the Tsarist government of Russia had been alarmed by revolution in Iran because of its possibly disturbing effect on its own Muslim peoples. But new perceptions of the Islamic world took time to appear. Well into the 1970s, the rest of the world tended to be obsessed by the Arab countries of the Middle East, and especially the oil-rich among them, when it thought of Islam much at all. This limited perception was also, for a long time, obscured and confused by the Cold War. The shape of that conflict sometimes blurred into older frameworks too. To some observers, a traditional Russian desire for influence in the area seemed to be a strand in Soviet policy, now nearer satisfaction than at any time in the past. The Soviet Union had by 1970 a worldwide naval presence rivaling that of the United States and established even in the Indian Ocean. Following British withdrawal from Aden in 1967, that base had been used by the Russians with the concurrence of the South Yemen government. All this was taking place at a time when further south too, there had been strategic setbacks for the Americans. The coming of the Cold War to the Horn of Africa and the former Portuguese colonies had added significance to the events taking place further north. Yet Soviet policy, in a longer perspective, does not appear to have benefited much within the Muslim world from the notable disarray of American policy in the mid 1970s in the Middle East. Egypt had by then fallen out with Syria and had turned to the United States in the hope of making a face-saving peace with Israel. When in 1975, the General Assembly of the United Nations denounced Zionism as a form of racism and granted the PLO observer status in the assembly, Egypt was inevitably more isolated from other Arab states. By this time, the PLO's activity across the northern border was not only harassing Israel but also driving Lebanon, once a bastion of Western values and now a PLO sanctuary, into ruin and disintegration. In 1978, Israel invaded southern Lebanon in the hope of ending the PLO raids. Although the non-Islamic world applauded when the Israeli and Egyptian prime ministers met in Washington the following year to agree a peace providing for Israel's withdrawal from Sinai, the Egyptians 3 years later paid the price of assassination by those who felt he had betrayed the Palestinian cause. The limited settlement between Israel and Egypt owed much to President Jimmy Carter, the Democratic candidate who had won the American presidential election of 1976. American morale was by then suffering from other setbacks than those in the Middle East. The Vietnam War had destroyed one president, and his successor's presidency had been built on the management of American defeat and the peace settlement. And it was soon clear how little that settlement was worth. There was in the background, too, the fear many Americans shared with the rising strength of the USSR in the ballistic missiles. All this affected American reactions to an almost wholly unforeseen event, the overthrow of the Shah of Iran. This not only dealt a damaging blow to the United States, but also revealed a potentially huge new dimension to the troubles of the Middle East and the volatility of Islam. Long the recipient of American favor, as a reliable ally in January 1979, the Shah was driven from his throne and country by a coalition of outraged liberals and Islamic conservatives. An attempt to secure constitutional government soon collapsed as popular support rallied to the Islamic faction. Iran's traditional ways and social structure had been shaken by a policy of modernization, in which the Shah had followed with less caution his father Reza Khan. Almost at once, there emerged a Shiite Islamic Republic, led by an elderly and fanatical cleric. The United States quickly recognized the new regime, but unavailingly. It was tarred with guilt by association as the pattern of the former Shah and the outstanding embodiment of capitalism and Western materialism. It was small consolation that the Soviet Union was soon undergoing similar vilification by the Iranian religious leaders as a second Satan threatening the purity of Islam. Some Americans were encouraged, though, when the particularly ferocious Ba'ath regime in Iraq, already viewed with favor for its ruthless execution and pursuit of Iraqi communists, fell out with the new Iran in a conflict inflamed, in spite of the Ba'athist secularism, by the traditional animosity of Mesopotamian Sunni and Persian Shiite Muslims. When in July 1979, Saddam Hussein took over as president in Baghdad, it looked encouraging to the CIA. It was thought that he was likely to offset the Iranian danger in the Gulf. This was the more welcome because the Iranian Revolution implied more than just the American loss of a client state. Even though a coalition of grievances had made possible the overthrow of the Shah, a speedy reversion to archaic tradition, strikingly in the treatment of women, showed that the more a ruler had been repudiated. The new Iranian Islamic Republic, although specifically Shiite, made universal claims. It was a theocracy where right rule stemmed from right belief, somewhat in the style of Calvin's Geneva. It was also an expression of a rage shared by many Muslims worldwide, especially in Arab land, at the onset of secular westernization and the failure of the promise of modernization. The Middle East, as nowhere else, nationalism, socialism, and capitalism had failed to solve the region's problems, or at least to satisfy passions and appetites they had aroused. Muslim fundamentalists thought that Ataturk, Reza Khan, and Nasir had all led their peoples down the wrong road. Islamic societies had successfully resisted the contagion of atheistic communism. But to many Muslims, the contagion of Western culture to which so many of their leaders had looked for a century or more now seemed even more threatening. Paradoxically, the Western revolutionary notion of capitalist exploitation helped to feed this revolution of feeling. The roots of Islamic fundamentalism, to use that unsatisfactory blanket term, were varied and very deep. They could tap centuries of struggle against Christianity. They were refreshed from the 1960s onwards by the obviously growing difficulties of outsiders, including the USSR, in imposing their will on the Middle East and Persian Gulf, given their Cold War divisions. There was the mounting evidence for many Muslim Arabs that the Western principle of nationality, advocated since the 1980s as an organizational remedy for instability that followed Turkish decline, had not worked. Only too evidently, the wars of the Ottoman succession were not over. A favorable conjunction of embarrassments for the West was made more promising, still by the recent revelation of the potency of the oil factor. But then there was also, since 1945, the growing awareness of pious Muslims that Western commerce, communications, and the simple temptations offered to those rich with oil were more dangerous to Islamic societies than any earlier, let alone purely military threat, had been. This made for strain and uneasiness. Yet those societies found it hard to move in step. Sunni and Shiite hostility went back centuries. In the post 1945 period, the Ba'ath socialist movement, which inspired many Muslims and which was nominally entrenched in Iraq, had become anathema to the Muslim Brotherhood, which deplored the godlessness of both sides even in the Palestinian quarrel. Popular sovereignty was a goal fundamentalists rejected. They sought Islamic control of society in all its aspects, so that before long the world began to be used to hearing that Pakistan forbade mixed hockey, that Saudi Arab punished crime by stoning to death and amputation of limbs, that Oman was building a university in which men and women students were to be segregated during lectures, and much, much more. By 1980, radical Islamists were powerful enough to secure their goals in some countries. Even students in comparatively westernized Egypt had already by 1978 been voting for them in their own elections, while some of the girls in medical school were refusing to dissect male corpses and demanded a segregated dual system of instruction. To put such attitudes in perspective, moreover, and at first sight, it is curious to Western eyes that student radicals should happily espouse such obviously reactionary causes. They have to be understood in the context of a long absence within Islam of any state or institutional theory, such as that of the West, even in orthodox hands, and even if it delivered some desirable goods. The state, as such, is not self evidently a legitimate authority in Islamic thought. And on top of that, the very introduction of state structures in Arab lands since the 19th century had been in imitation, conscious or unconscious, of the West. Youthful radicalism, which had tried and found wanting the politics of socialism, or what thought to be that, and was in any case another Western import, felt that no intrinsic value resided in the states or nations, they looked elsewhere. And that, in part, explains the efforts shown first in Libya and then in Iran and Algeria to promote new ways of legitimating authority. Whether the age old Islamic bias against public institutions and towards tribalism and the Brotherhood of Islam can be sustained remains to be seen. Even that Brotherhood, after all, has to recognize that most Muslims in the world do not understand Arabic. The potential for disorder and even internecine conflict in parts of the Islamic world makes it too tempting to simplify. The Islamic world is not culturally homogeneous, no more than the mythological West denounced in the 1980s by popular preachers in the mosques. Can Islam be identified convincingly as a coherent, discrete, neatly bordered civilization? Like the West, it is an abstraction, occasionally a useful shorthand for expository purposes. Many Muslims, including some of our religious caste of mind, seek a footing in two worlds, committed in a measure to both Western and Islamic ideals. Each world represents a historical center of dynamism, a source of energies, but This looks truer of Western civilization, however defined, than of any possible reading of Islam. As for the disturbing violence of Islamic politics in many Arab states, it is often the outcome of a simple polarization between repressive authoritarianism on the one hand and the radical wave of the other. In the 1980s, both Morocco and Algeria were to find their domestic order thus troubled. The situation was made the more dangerous and explosive by demography. The average age of most Islamic societies is said to be between 15 and 18, and they are growing at very fast rates. There is just too much youthful energy and frustration about for the outlook to be promising for peace. This helps to explain why soon after the Iranian Revolution, students in Tehran worked off some of their exasperation by storming the American embassy and seizing diplomats and others as hostages. A startled world suddenly found the Iranian government supporting them, taking custody of the hostages and endorsing the students' demand for the return of the Shah to face trial. President Carter could hardly have faced a more awkward situation, for at that moment, American policy in the Islamic world was, above all, preoccupied with the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. A severance of diplomatic relations with Iran and the imposition of economic sanctions were the first responses. Then came an attempted rescue operation which failed dismally. The unhappy hostages were in the end to be recovered by negotiations and, in effect, a ransom. The return of the Iranian assets in the United States, which had been frozen at the time of the revolution. But the humiliation of the Americans was by no means the sole or even the major importance of the episode. Besides its wide policy repercussions, the retention of the hostages was in another way symbolic. It was a shock registered in a unanimous vote of condemnation at the UN to the convention, evolved first in Europe and then developed over more than 3 centuries throughout the civilized world. That diplomatic envoys should be immune from interference. The Iranian government's action announced that it was not playing by the accepted rules. That was a blatant rejection of civilized assumptions, which forced some in the West to wonder for the first time what else Islamic revolution might imply.